This is Duke University.
I'd like to, of course, thank Robin Kirk and the Human Rights Program for inviting me, and thanks to everyone who showed up. And I'd like to extend a special thanks to people who were here, who knew me when and knew me since, and showed up anyway. And I really appreciate that. It means I haven't been forgotten. So I was asked to talk about teaching civil rights, and since I teach civil rights history courses, I thought that was something I could do. But in preparing for this talk, I started to think about what's important about teaching this topic, and about what professors want to accomplish in teaching such a course, and to recognize how the courses I've taught have evolved over time. And that is to facilitate students' ability to recognize and wrestle with their doubts about the past. Teaching them to read critically, to argue persuasively, and to communicate well, to reason carefully, to expand their historical knowledge in ways that ground an informed discourse and further inquiry on their part. And of course, to enhance their awareness of the past and their appreciation of it. But I also think it's more than that in a world that sees rights as a critical piece of citizenship nationally and globally. I think it's important for students to understand the connections among race, power, privilege, and rights. And so I focus a lot of my attention on those issues. And I always try to bring current issues into the classroom. In fact, I do that so much the department now has me teaching a course called History in the Headlines. Actually in yesterday's class, we discussed the history of voting rights in light of the recent Supreme Court decisions. But you know, there are some basics, even in getting into the conceptual and thematic issues. There are some basics I think students need to understand. And one of those is chronology. I wish I had been able to find my PowerPoint because I wanted to show you the timeline of U.S. history that I start with. It begins in 1500 with the presence of blacks as a part of European and African exchanges, and of course with Columbus, and continues up through the millennium to the election of Obama. It's divided into four pieces and it falls together quite nicely with the beginning of the sale of Africans in Virginia in the 1620-somethings. I'm going blank here. With the Civil War actually falling midpoint in that timeline. I'm sorry, the American Revolution falls midpoint in that timeline. The Civil War falls 3/4 of the way. And so when we get to the Brown decision, the Voting Rights Act of 65, Civil Rights Act of 64, there's only about this much of the timeline where it's clear that African Americans have federally protected civil rights, although they have this very long history. And that's one of the things that makes them begin to rethink, reconsider how they thought about the black past. And I really like that. I get them to discuss these kinds of things, and then I overlay that with another timeline of African American history, and kind of compare the narrative of U.S. history to the narrative of African American history. I have to tell you though, it's very hard, especially with freshmen and sophomores, and even juniors and seniors, to break down what they have learned from high school textbooks, particularly in this day of standardized testing, when they are out to seek the right answer. And what I want them to do is to ask uncomfortable questions and then to pursue the answers to that. But I try to start where they are, which means that my course does not look at all like the graduate course that I took. But this helps them, this exercise itself helps them to see chronology in a very different way. They have embraced the classical civil rights timeline, the one that begins in 1954 and ends in 1968. And their knowledge base about civil rights activists is simply restricted to that area. And so, set against that timeline, I think, my timeline, it looks like African Americans have been waiting since Reconstruction for Rosa Parks to be tired, and for a group of black men to stand up to a store manager, or for Martin Luther King to have a dream, or for a Southern president to sign a series of federal laws. And we did have to wait for that one. But anyway, in their minds, Thurgood Marshall, Williams Brown, Little Rock 9, desegregated Central High School, 4 students sit in at Greensboro, people march on Washington, laws get passed, King dies, the civil rights movement ends. And now it's time to memorialize and celebrate that change. As the poet Carl Wendell Hines writes about MLK, now that he is safely dead, let us praise him. Build monuments to his glory, sing hosannas to his name. Dead men make such convenient heroes. They cannot rise to challenge the images we fashion from their lives. And besides, it's easier to build monuments than to make a better world. I encourage them to break this paradigm and to see black activism as a tradition. And each of the civil rights points that they can point to, I spent some time pointing out to other precedents, like the NAACP ran a series of cases that began in the 1930s that paved the road to Brown. There have been boycotts of public transportation for as long as there's been public transportation. And as go back to old Myron Ruggitt, thank you, Ray Gavins. Myron Ruggitt wrote in every state and many cities of the South which passed segregation laws between 1891 and 1906, their enforcement precipitated boycotts. And they go through this list of 22 or 23 cities where there were all kinds of hell raising besides boycotts. And I'm impressed with that research because they did it before the newspapers were digitized. And I have a hard time imagining going through all of that material. I also point out that there have been boycotts of neighborhood stores in retaliation for poor treatment or for the refusal to hire black workers in the neighborhood. In the 1940s, Congress of Racial Equality and students of Howard, led by Pauli Murray, used what they call the school sitting method to demand desegregation of lunch counters and cafes in Washington, D.C. And in 1917, black organizations collaborated to assemble a silent march against violence and for civil rights down Fifth Avenue in New York City. So this long before the movement theme, as many of you know, enters a debate that historians are having a great time with. The question of when did the civil rights movement actually begin? This was taken up by Jacqueline Dowd Hall, our colleague from UNC, who made her presidential address to the Organization of American Historians in 2005. She proposed that the dominant narrative of what is called the classical narrative, the classical years of the movement running from 54 to 65 or 58, again from Brown and Montgomery to the Voting Rights Act or the death of Martin Luther King, that dominant chronology prevents us from seeing the tradition of resistance and protest that came long before. And moreover, Hall argues, and I'm going to quote here, such perspective simultaneously elevates and diminishes the movement. It ensures that status of the classical phase as a triumphal moment in a larger American progress narrative, yet undermines its gravitas. It prevents one of the most remarkable mass movements in American history from speaking effectively to the challenges of our time. Now, it's not my intent here to answer that question long or short. I think it's an interesting one, but it's not my point. My purpose really is to highlight a different point that Paul makes about why it's important to ask that question in the first place. And here, Paul turns to contemporary politics and lays out how the narrowing of civil rights years and our popular understanding of the civil rights movement has allowed the conservative right to usurp a complex narrative in a way that makes those years something, and that movement to something that's over. It's over and it's done with. Laws were passed, programs were administered, opportunities offered, and now we're done with all of that. And this further encourages the conservative right to believe that the nation can now be absolved of any responsibility to address the persistent problems of institutional racism that continue to exist. This flattening of what was also a contentious era, not only among blacks and whites, not only among Americans, but among African Americans themselves. This positive story ignores any activism that came before, and thus it erases that long timeline of slavery and Jim Crow. And by extension, I think it also absolves the right of any accountability for the past. And what we hear, what we're finding, and what we're reading, if you watch Fox News, I can't stand to, is an appropriation of the language and actions of the Black freedom movement. That conservatives have literally inverted the rhetoric of citizenship rights and made this an issue of individual rights. And in such a rhetoric, in that rhetorical context, current demands for rights seem to be represented then as incursions into individual rights. Note, for example, the intentional use of personhood as a term in the abortion debates. Grievances about special rights or reverse racism are seen as losses of those individual rights, and to oppose benefits falling to the alleged, and allows this group to oppose benefits, any benefits, any assistance that might fall to the allegedly undeserving people of color. The Tea Party has used race to forge a coalition among whites that encourages the poor and middle class to vote against their own interests. It is to leave themselves behind. Seeing it in this light now, what people of color call racism or whatever, whites see those as occasional incidents rather than as patterns. And I hear this on campus among my students all the time. They see incidents as misunderstandings, simple misunderstandings that are unenlightened at best and intentional misunderstandings at worst. But in the meantime, as we all know, racial harassment like stop and frisk echo the Jim Crow practice of arresting black men as vagrants without cases, and the sham of the criminal justice system which imprisoned them in the Jim Crow era and leased them out to white landowners or to companies, actually parallels the way that Michelle Alexander and Angela Davis see the prison industrial complex as private institutions that put the imprisoned persons to work for profit. And of course there's violence, most notably the murder of Trayvon Martin, and a rhetoric that made the court case the Trayvon Martin trial and not the George Zimmerman trial. and of course violence against other African Americans continue against a historical backdrop of the many murders of the Jim Crow era. Segregated and underfunded schools provide inadequate education, which, given the context of current economic trends, fails to facilitate students' preparation for future employment. Liberal arts education is getting de-emphasized for students of color, traded off for what we might think of as skills or vocational ed, as though such students are incapable of learning. The vicious slashing of funding for the safety net, now seen by conservatives as necessary, has left a void that struggling people cannot fill with their hunger, their restricted options in housing, their limited employment possibilities, their inadequate access to health care, and the unjust inequities of law enforcement. So one wonders if these problems can actually be solved by civil rights legislation. It is increasingly clear that this suffering, however, can be exacerbated by legislation. And this is the point that more of the moral Mondays protests are trying to make. In protesting the legislature, where representatives where conservative Republican representatives hold positions that take such cruel measures that we know will create poverty outcomes. So this makes me wonder if really these are human rights issues rather than civil rights issues that are and have been articulated but not directly addressed as such in the drive for civil rights. And if we turn to Carol Anderson, whose wonderful book, Eyes Off the Prize, is the first book we read in my class, she will argue that these are the issues that were articulated by everyday people through the Jim Crow era. Eyes Off the Prize argues that over time, Black leaders themselves narrowed the freedom movement from a focus on, to focus on overt political and legal discrimination, which is sort of a definition of civil rights. Human rights, which encompasses the political and legal, but also emphasizes human needs like education, housing, healthcare, and employment, seem to fall by the wayside. The right to not suffer, the right to not fear, the right to be assured safety and security as persons, as well as citizens, is a different kind of issue that we must take up. The interviews from the Behind the Veil Project, as Professor Chafe noted, headed by Chafe, Gabbins, and Korstad. Almost every one of the interviewees gave examples of violence. Almost everyone made a reference to hunger, their own or someone else's. Almost everyone spoke about distressed housing circumstances. Because we asked specifically, every interview discusses employment limitations, physical exhaustion, educational constraints. But they also reveal the quotidian nature of sickness and death. And of course, violence. And so I wonder then if in our work on the project is seeking forms of resistance and articulations of Black politics, if somehow or other we have missed something that we might go back and capture. Let me take the case of hunger, for instance, and I'm drawing here specifically from interviews. Dorothy Fletcher Steele, middle-class Black teacher from Charlotte, quoted in her interview, "I knew so many cases where I just made up and paid a little out of my pocket," which we all did. But we knew at that time that many of these children had to come to school hungry. Another interview revealed what her parents had told her about Black life in the 1930s, about, quote, about how bad people were starving, hungry, and they couldn't get anything, that they were just living off whatever they could raise. They might have little gardens or do whatever they could to survive. S.C. Alexander said, I knew of some families that had less than we had. This after she talked about her own family's poverty. And I guess there were so many of us to work, it made it a little easier for us. My mother used to gather vegetables and what have you, and we had chickens and things. Sometimes she fixed a lot of food and everybody came by and ate along with us. And what we didn't have, maybe somebody else had. Now we've looked to these kinds of things and seen them and seen survival mechanisms as forms of resistance, the positive aspects of Black community life. But I think we need to pay even closer attention to some of these phrases. Quote, many of these children had to come to school hungry. How bad people were starving, and what we didn't have. So I've come to think that human rights, or rather the trumping of them, was the core intent and most important effect of Jim Crow, making true C. Vann Woodward's comment that Jim Crow, the system, intended not only to hold African Americans to a fixed subordinate place in society, but to push them further down. And I think this is a compelling point, for in truth, demands for human rights and an end to the violations of them appear across the timeline of Black activism. Responses to lynching and sexual violence might be the most obvious of those. And clearly the persistent horrific violence against African Americans, indeed against people of color in the United States, is an impeachable fact. That during the Jim Crow era, which is the particular area of my own research, whites used violence to enforce discriminatory laws. So it wasn't just that there were segregation laws or discriminatory laws, that they were enforced further by violence. Not only the lynching of Black men and the rape of Black women, but the abuse of Black children, the burning of Black schools and churches, the bombings of Black neighborhoods, the destruction of Black towns, race riots, and random aggressions. All of these assaults and affronts and abuses have been documented historically, and they attest collectively to Jim Crow as homegrown terrorism, as American apartheid that was sanctioned not only by individual whites, but with the complicity of local and state governments by the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the President of the United States. Now, under these conditions, and where Kelly Murphy, makes that point in her book, Right to Ride, for African Americans to act and act directly through organized protest in a society where Black men and women were hunted like sport, the valiant and popular fight to defend Black citizenship and protest the dignity of everyday life, especially in this context. To speak at all was a radical and dangerous tactic. So let me turn here to what might be a familiar story to pick up this theme and point out how we might see human rights where we've seen civil rights. Ida B. Wells, the well-known anti-lynching activist, had been a Memphis school teacher and an outspoken one at that, who wrote in a newspaper about the poor conditions of the Black public schools and was fired for doing so. In 1875, riding in a railroad car, the white railroad car, the ladies' car, where she thought she should be, she refused to move from her seat. The conductor had to pull her up and physically remove her, and she bit him. Having lost her job, she invested in a local newspaper, a local Black newspaper, Memphis Free Speech, of which she became the editor. And from there, she could speak as openly as she wanted to about the Black community and racial issues. Wells became an anti-lynching crusader after what she calls in her autobiography, the lynching in Memphis which changed my whole course of my life. In 1892, a set of brutal murders provided Wells with this new direction. You may know this story too. 3 young black men opened a grocery store at the Curve, which is a spot in a predominantly black neighborhood of Memphis, where the trolley made a sharp turn. They opened the store because Moss and his neighbors, quote, were made to feel that they were not welcome by the white grocer who owned the store in that area. And the black store then was popular and successful. And so it competed directly with the white store, this being an act of resistance to not put up with this situation and to move on their own. And following a minor altercation between black and white kids, local whites armed with guns launched an assault on the store, entered through the back door, and fired on the black shopkeepers, who fired back. The police didn't announce who they were. The 3 co-owners were arrested, and the local paper launched the usual kind of campaign that we see in this era to whip up a racial frenzy that inevitably would lead to violence. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart were dragged from the jail and lynched. And then in response to the outrage expressed by blacks, which itself whipped up another racial frenzy on the part of whites, a judge issued an order for the sheriff to take 100 men and go out to the Curve at once and shoot down on sight any Negro who appears to be making trouble. And in the South during this era, that order was the equivalent of declaring open season on black people, and whites, of course, intended to obey. In the weeks that followed the lynching and the melee, African Americans in Memphis started to seem to turn really quiet. Many local blacks joined the exodus, the westward migration of African Americans out of the South to Kansas and Oklahoma. Hundreds disposed of their property, Wells wrote, and they left. Ministers and entire congregations went. Memphis has never seen such an upheaval among colored people, Wells penned in her autobiography. Business in Memphis had come to a standstill because black people had launched a boycott, not only of businesses, but of the town, as well as of the trolley. Whether by collaboration or organization, Memphis blacks decided not to spend any of their money in any place that was white. 6 weeks after the lynching, Wells continues, 2 officials from the transit company came to her newspaper office to ask the editors to use their influence with the colored people to get them riding on the streetcars again. I'm going to read here from Wells's autobiography. When I asked why they came to us, the reply was that colored people had been their best patrons, but that there had been a marked falling off of their patronage. And I asked why they thought this was the case. They said they didn't know. They had heard Negroes were afraid of electricity. They wanted to assure our people that there was no danger, and to tell them that any discourtesy towards them, an interesting admission, would be punished severely. Wells pointed out to those officials that black people had been riding the streetcars regularly until the previous 6 weeks when the lynching took place. And that even though the service was owned by Northern capitalists, it was run by Southern lynchers. She told them, quote, "We have learned that every white man in any standing in town knew of the plan and consented to the lynching of our boys. And because of that, black people wanted to get away from Memphis. So we told them to save their nickels and dimes so that they could do so." And she added that she was participating in the action. This is in her diary. She writes, "I have walked more than I ever did in my life before." When the streetcar officials left the offices of the free speech, Wells wrote up the interview and cheered her people to keep up the good work and keep on staying off the cars. I think the Wells story tells us that in response to an injustice, African Americans had launched a set of organized protests, a boycott not only of white businesses, etc. But they did so not as a civil rights act. They did so as a human rights act. There was no racial segregation in Memphis at that time. So this could not have been a protest against segregation. Black folks in Memphis responded to the lynching of 3 black men, a violation of their human rights to safety and security. And they did so in the context of a rising number of lynchings beginning to unfold in the 1880s. And so their protest spoke beyond the city of Memphis itself to that practice throughout the region. Now, perhaps because the Memphis boycott was followed by dozens of others, which were generated in response to an increasing number of segregation laws, perhaps for that reason, the human rights aspect of what they were doing has been overshadowed, subsumed to an arc of civil rights activity. I think that's something interesting for us to think about too. See if I can balance all of these things. The right to be humans. And we might interpret other protests the same way. In 1917, the NAACP and other groups organized a silent protest march down Fifth Avenue in New York City, as I said before, too. And that was to protest the violence of the East St. Louis massacre, which had killed thousands, injured thousands, and left thousands homeless. Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns organized by Detroit's Housewife League by Adam Clayton Powell in New York City spoke not just to the problem of exclusion from jobs, but to the effects of unemployment. We even see this reference to human rights in the Montgomery bus boycott. Coretta Scott King, in her Eyes of the Prize interview about Montgomery, notes, quote, "At first we asked for just a more humane form of segregation." King himself had said in the late 1960s that human rights should be the next matter to tackle. That was behind his plan for the Poor People's Campaign and March. And we see this human rights agenda again in the Black Panther Party's 10-point statement. Their demands for full employment, decent housing, education, an end to police brutality, the release of black men from prison, and of course their summary, quote, "We want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace." So I want to turn to, so one of the other things I do is to use primary source documents. And one of the things I give my students, see if I can bring it up. Perhaps we can. Hello? Should wake up. Wake up, there we go. There it is. Is this document. Oh, there it is. 1945, the historian Herbert Aptheker brought his historian's eye to the effects of Jim Crow. And after presenting in his own study the well-known statistics about employment classifications and incomes by race, Aptheker concluded, quote, "These statistics represent food, homes, life, and death. But the evidence regarding black health and rates of mortality argued, quote, this oppression cripples and kills, and unequal educational opportunities degraded an entire population. Peonage and violence represented a type of barbarism." And Aptheker concluded that the effect upon the mental life of both the victims and the manipulators of this economic, social, political, and physical machine of oppression is throttling and killing the people of the entire nation. Now, Aptheker's study then got picked up by the Civil Rights, by the National Negro Congress, which to accompany this petition to the United Nations on behalf of 13 million oppressed Negro citizens of the United States of America. And so here now I can turn to context with the 1946 founding of the United Nations and its initial discussion of creating a Declaration of Human Rights. In light of the war's atrocities in Europe and Asia, the UN was an international organization committed to maintaining international peace and security, to develop friendly relations, but also to promote social progress better living standards, and human rights, and that's directly from the UN's own website. And so here we can connect American human rights struggles at the mid-20th century to the international human rights movement of the era, the strengthening of apartheid and the Black freedom movement unfolding in South Africa, the freedom struggles of the Middle East, of Western and Central Africa, and the comparison that the world was making to the situation of oppressed and colonized people to the situation of African Americans in the United States. I think that telling this broader story helps students expand their concept of the civil rights movement, which is what I want them to do. But then it also helps them to see that this is a global issue connected to human rights, and that America is not necessarily the leader in an international rights struggle, even if it is the main organizer of the language of civil rights when it came to the UN. Now, I don't mean this as necessarily a criticism, but I think of it as a teaching opportunity to bring my students' attention to the synergy of demands for human and civil rights before Brown and Montgomery and contemporarily. In 1948, the UN finally embraced the official Declaration of Human Rights as it applies to all nations. And I'm tempted to read the preamble because it recognizes the, quote, inherent dignity and the equal and unalienable rights of all members of the human family. And human rights creates the foundation for freedom, justice, and peace in the world. But the preamble ends finally, now therefore, the General Assembly proclaims this Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to that end, that every individual and every organ of society, keeping this declaration constant in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for those rights and freedoms by progressive measures, national and international. In context then, it's a good, let me point out two other things. That Article 3 of the Declaration states everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. And Article 25 specifically states everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or lack of livelihood. Now remember, the United States led the writing of the Declaration. And so African Americans took advantage of this moment to turn their attention to the injuries suffered by blacks in the United States, where the Civil Rights Congress, which was really an organization of individuals that included Du Bois and Paul Robeson, sent a second transmittal, this one more chilling and more damning. The document was called We Charge Genocide, and it was accompanied by hundreds of pages of evidence of violence, examples of calls for violence by white leaders and officials. We Charge Genocide was one of several petitions, of course, but this one used particularly strong language to present, quote, a record of mass slayings on the basis of race, of lives deliberately warped and distorted by the willful creation of conditions making for premature death, poverty, and disease. In its intro, reads, out of the inhuman black ghettos of American cities, out of the cotton plantations of the South, comes this record of mass slayings on the basis of race, lives deliberately warped and distorted. Deliberately warped and distorted. The willful creation of conditions making for premature death. And that language is so strong. It doesn't speak to voting rights. It doesn't speak to access to public accommodations. it speaks about quality of life issues. And they also point out that sometimes incorrectly, genocide means a complete and definitive destruction of a race or people. The Genocide Convention, however, adopted by the General Assembly in 1948, defines genocide as, quote, any intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, racial, ethnic, or religious group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to the group. This is genocide as well as the killing of the group. And the Civil Rights Congress then concluded, we maintain before the oppressed Negro citizens of the United States, segregated, discriminated against, and long the target of violence, suffer from genocide as a result of consistent, conscious, unified policies in every branch of government. Ossie Davis wrote the preface. We will submit no longer to the brutal indignities being practiced against us. We will not be intimidated, and most certainly not eliminated. We claim the ancient rights of all people, not only to survive unhindered, but to participate as equals in man's inheritance here on earth. We fight to preserve ourselves, to see the treasured ways of our life in common, not to destroy or not to be destroyed by brutal men or heedless institutions. We charge genocide. Indeed, we do. So if I might return now for my final comments to the work of Carol Anderson in the post-World War II context of the Cold War, human rights as a global ideology was shifted the whole conversation about rights in the 1940s and into the 1950s. It was one of entire categories of rights that pointed to aspirations for human freedom, but it became an ideological battlefield, not surprisingly, between the United States and the USSR, that in the end silenced Black demands for human rights by accusing Black activists of affiliations with communism. To the rest of the world, it looked like American hypocrisy, the tendency to preach one ideology and practice another. Anderson goes a step further, and I just want to introduce this and maybe we can talk about it a bit more, that Black leaders, under this kind of scrutiny, that they narrowed their own discussion of human rights, which included civil rights, to simply civil rights, because that's what they thought they could achieve, and not the others. And perhaps by achieving civil rights, they might be able to address their human rights issues. So one of the most important outcomes for me of teaching this link between human rights and civil rights side of the Black freedom struggle is that students come to understand the limitations of civil rights language and the concept of civil rights itself. Now, this doesn't mean that civil rights is not important, because it's through these rights that African Americans connect to the body politic, and they call on the Constitution for its privileges and protections. But Black people could not be freed by hymns, or by freedom songs, by marches, boycotts, or sit-ins, or even by voting rights drives, or demonstrations, or by school desegregation. It's simply not enough. So returning finally to the human rights aspect for the Americas and for the international community, this provides vast sources of information for study and new perspectives on the American past and Black past. But it also lets us turn to a new direction, if we were to pick up that theme, to turn in a new direction, to refreshen a language of struggle and renewal, and to focus now on the basics of human dignity. And so, may Duke embrace just such an initiative. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.